What would you do if the world you'd built powerful, polished, untouchable, suddenly collided with someone who asked for nothing, yet made you feel everything? Charles Whitaker was a man who could buy anything except peace. A billionaire boardroom shark with a legacy to protect, not a life to live. Until a wrong turn, a broken car, and a soft-spoken seamstress named Grace Holloway unravel everything he thought he knew. She lived in a small Brooklyn shop, sewing hope into worn fabric and broken stories. He lived in glass towers, trading futures and forgetting his own. Now ask yourself this: if you were him, would you dare to stay? Would you risk losing your empire to gain something your money could never touch? This is not a love story. It's a transformation of a man, a woman, and maybe the world around them. If you've ever wondered whether kindness can crack even the hardest heart, stay, breathe, listen, like, share, and subscribe to join us in this journey through stitched lives, softened truths, and a love that no fortune could buy. Let's begin. The Manhattan skyline lay cloaked beneath a thick ceiling of gray clouds. From the 47th floor of Whitaker Tower, the glass windows reflected only cold light and sharper shadows. Inside the executive boardroom, silence ruled, heavy and taut. Charles Whitaker stood at the head of the table, his back straight, suit immaculate, and expression unreadable. The storm brewing outside was nothing compared to the one he'd just unleashed in this room. "You're all dismissed," he said, voice calm as if discussing coffee orders. Effective immediately. Gasps broke out across the long mahogany table. A senior VP stood halfway, mouth opening to protest, but Charles raised a hand. "You've had 6 months and a multi-million-dollar budget. Results still disappoint. This is not a charity. Clean out your desks." He turned, the movement efficient and final. His leather shoes made no sound against the polished floor as he exited, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Outside, his assistant Nathan trailed behind, tablet in hand. "That's the 4th board this fiscal year, sir." Charles didn't pause. "Then we're overdue for results. 3 miles away, in the heart of a quieter Brooklyn block." Grace Holloway tugged gently at a stubborn thread. Her small sewing studio, stitched in grace, was a warm contrast to Charles's world's soft light. Shelves of colorful fabrics, and the scent of lavender tea in the air. A radio played a jazz ballad low in the background as she crouched beside a little girl in a frilly yellow dress. "Now, turn slowly for me, sweetie. There we go. This hem just needs a bit of love," Grace murmured with a soft smile, pinning the last edge with practiced hands. The child's mother, a tired nurse coming off the night shift, sat sipping tea and watching with a quiet kind of gratitude that Grace had come to cherish more than any checkbook figure. That same afternoon, fate, or perhaps misfortune, rolled into motion. Charles's Bentley sputtered to a stop just a block from Grace's studio. The driver, temporarily away grabbing a coffee, had left him to his own devices. Charles glanced at his Rolex, frowned, and looked around. He spotted a small sign above a narrow storefront: alterations, repairs, restorations. He stepped inside. A little bell rang overhead. Grace looked up, needle still in hand, lips parted in surprise at the sight of a tall, sharply dressed man filling her doorway. "Apologies," Charles said briskly. "I'm in need of a phone, or someone to call a service vehicle. My car's down." Grace arched an eyebrow. "This is a sewing studio, not." His gaze swept the room. "Clearly, clearly," she echoed, setting down her needle. "But I do have a landline. Antique, just like this place." He noticed the mismatched furniture, the cozy clutter, the sunlight that poured in through lace curtains. She handed him a phone, then watched him dial, curt and efficient. Even his thank you, barely audible, came out like a transaction. As he turned to leave, Grace said, "You might be powerful, but you wear stress like a second suit." Charles paused, his fingers still on the doorknob. Grace tilted her head. "No offense, just—" "You look like you haven't exhaled in years." He didn't respond, just walked out. That night, Charles couldn't sleep. He stood at his penthouse window, sipping a scotch older than most marriages. But it tasted bitter tonight. His mind kept returning not to the failed boardroom, not to the financial charts on his desk, but to a sewing needle, a yellow dress, and a woman who dared to comment on his breathing. He didn't like the way it unsettled him. It reminded him too much of his mother's voice, soft and gone too soon. Meanwhile, Grace stayed late at the studio, patching an old quilt for the neighborhood shelter. She thought briefly of the man from earlier, the one who looked like he belonged on a Forbes cover, but spoke like he didn't know how to say please. She shook her head and smiled. "They're all the same," she told her cat, a gray tabby curled on the windowsill. "Big suits, big wallets, small hearts. Yet something about his eyes cold. Yes, but tired too. Not just tired. Worn." Grace wasn't one to judge a stranger by a first impression. She'd been misjudged often enough herself. The next morning, Charles Whitaker arrived at Whitaker Tower before sunrise. As always, the city still stretched its limbs under the amber haze of dawn. But he was already reading quarterly forecasts with the precision of a scalpel. Numbers were comforting, predictable, obedient. Yet, amidst revenue lines and market trends, a single intrusive image kept returning her: Grace Holloway, with her tea-scented shop, soft hands, and that maddeningly steady gaze. Her words clung to his memory. "You wear stress like a second suit." He shut the laptop harder than necessary. At lunchtime, his assistant Nathan approached with a cautious knock. "There's a charity auction in Brooklyn next week. The firm's been invited." "Decline," Charles replied, eyes still on a digital report. "They mentioned a community initiative," Nathan added. "Something about sewing programs for underprivileged women, organized by a Grace Holloway." Charles blinked. He looked up, then sat back slowly. The coincidence wasn't lost on him. "Send a donation," he said after a pause, "and send flowers, nothing extravagant, simple, honest." Nathan looked surprised, but nodded. Charles stared out the window again. That evening, he drove himself and Anomaly down to Grace's street. The studio lights were still on. He sat in the car, engine running, debating why he didn't need thanks. He didn't even need her to notice. And yet, when he stepped into the shop, unannounced, it was the warmth of the space that hit him first. Not just the temperature, but the feeling. The air smelled like cinnamon thread and hope. Her back was turned, gently pressing a finished dress into shape. She glanced up, startled. "Mr. Whitaker Charles," he corrected. "I was nearby." Her eyes flickered with curiosity. not judgment. "Is your car broken again?" He nearly smiled. Not this time. She set down the iron and crossed her arms, playfully guarded. "So what brings the steel man of Manhattan back to my humble shop?" He held up a small envelope. "A contribution. For your charity project." Grace took it, opened it without ceremony. Her brows lifted slightly at the amount. "That's generous," she said simply. "It's only money," Charles replied. "And yet," she said, meeting his eyes, "you came in person. That's rarer." A moment of silence stretched between them. "I was wondering," he began, uncharacteristically unsure, "if you needed help preparing for the event." Grace looked him over. Tailored suit, cufflinks, the faintest edge of perfume, more boardroom than bakery. "You want to help with needle and thread." Charles straightened. "I'm a fast learner. You don't look like a fast sewer." "I don't plan to sew," he said quickly, before adding, "unless necessary." Grace laughed, a warm, honeyed sound that made the shop feel even smaller, even safer. "All right then," she said. "You can wind the bobbins." The hours that followed were the strangest Charles had known in years. He sat at a small wooden table, fumbling with thread and plastic spools, while Grace worked beside him, humming softly. She moved with a kind of grace that matched her name, efficient, but unhurried, comfortable in her own skin. "Why sewing?" he asked finally, watching her stitch with ease. "My mother taught me," she said, not looking up. "She said there's something holy about mending what others throw away." Charles was silent. "That why you started this project?" he asked. Grace paused, then nodded. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here. Some of the women, they've never had anything of their own, not even clothes that fit. We give them skills, dignity, community." He was quiet for a long moment. "No one taught me to sew," he said. She looked at him. "What did they teach you?" He hesitated. How to win, how to cut loss, how to never cry. Grace reached for another pin. "That's a lot of armor for one life." He didn't reply. Later that night, as he left, Charles paused by the doorway. "May I return?" he asked. Grace smiled faintly. "If you promise not to ruin my bobbins, I'll bring my own thread. You don't strike me as a man who shops for thread." "You'd be surprised," he said, stepping out into the night, feeling, for once, like he didn't need to inhale quite so deeply just to breathe. Back in his penthouse, Charles sat down without turning on the lights. The room glowed faintly with city light, and the silence felt less oppressive tonight. He looked down at his hands clean, but he could still smell fabric and warm tea. He hadn't laughed in years, not really. And tonight he almost had. Almost. A week passed, and Charles Whitaker returned to Stitched in Grace every evening, each time a little less stiff, a little more present. On Tuesday, he learned how to untangle thread without snapping it. By Thursday, he could almost tell the difference between satin and crepe. On Saturday, he broke her sewing machine. It wasn't out of recklessness, but out of trying too hard. Grace had handed him a nearly finished dress for a teenage girl headed to her first recital. It was pale blue, delicate, and meant to make the wearer feel like a star. "Just run the hem through once. Carefully," she'd said, her hand briefly brushing his. He nodded, determined. Only he hadn't secured the tension wheel properly. The machine sputtered, whirred, then groaned like an old man getting out of bed, and the fabric tore straight through. Grace rushed over, her expression unreadable. I, I'm sorry, Charles said quietly, holding the shredded edge like a man who'd broken something sacred. For a moment, she just stared at the ruined hem. Then she looked up, let out a long breath, and shrugged. Mistakes happen, she said gently, even from men in $1,000 shoes. He looked at her, surprised. You're not mad? Oh, I'm fuming, she said with a half smile. But more at myself for giving you the important job? Charles cracked a small laugh, and something shifted. It was the first time in years someone had forgiven him for failure without flinching. No retribution. No icy silence. Just kindness. That night, as the storm rolled in and rain tapped the window panes, they worked side by side to remake the dress. Grace had brought out cocoa and a second sewing machine. Charles, sleeves rolled, tried again this time with her guiding his hands. This one's for Emily, Grace said, gesturing to the dress. She's 14. Her dad left last year. She stopped singing for a while. She's performing again. Yes, first time since. Charles was quiet. They stitched in tandem for a while. You ever wish you could go back? Grace asked softly. To where to before everything was? Numbers and suits and towers. He didn't answer right away. I don't know if I ever had a before, he said finally. Boarding school at 7, summers with tutors, every moment a rehearsal for the man I had to become. Grace nodded, not pushing. And you, he asked. My mom ran this shop for 30 years, she said. I used to hide in that corner under the pattern drawers, pretending I was a queen, designing gowns. She smiled wistfully. She passed 3 years ago. Cancer, quick and cruel. I took over the shop to keep her dream breathing. Sometimes I still think she's watching. She'd be proud, he said sincerely. Grace met his eyes. You think so? I do. The storm outside quieted into a gentle drizzle. Inside, the dress was nearly finished. Charles held it up, carefully smoothing the fabric. Grace stood back, admiring their work. She'll shine, she said. So will you, he murmured, almost without meaning to. Their eyes met, and then something shifted again, only this time. It wasn't gentle. It was sudden, electric, unspoken. But Grace turned first, clearing her throat. You hungry? I've got leftover lasagna. Charles exhaled. The tension diffused. Sure. They sat on mismatched stools, sharing dinner under the soft hum of the overhead lamp. Her lasagna was imperfect, too much cheese, not enough salt, but somehow it was the best thing he'd tasted in years. Later, as he walked to his car, Grace called after him. You did good today, she said, arms folded, leaning against the doorway. I ruined a machine. You fixed a dress. I also bent 3 needles. Grace grinned. Progress, not perfection. Charles hesitated. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Letting me in? Teaching me? Trusting me? Grace's smile softened. Because someone once did that for me. And because I think you're trying. Charles nodded slowly, unsure of what to do with the warmth in his chest. He drove home in silence. But that night, he didn't open his laptop. He didn't check market reports. He didn't even turn on the television. He just sat in the dark, staring at his hands again. And this time, they didn't feel so cold. A week later, Charles Whitaker stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the lapels of a suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. The fabric was flawless, the color sharp, but something about it felt wrong. Or maybe it was the reason he was wearing it. Across town, Grace Holloway was staring at her reflection too, in a dress she'd stitched herself. It was a muted lavender, simple but elegant, her hair swept up with a pearl pin her mother once wore. Tonight was the annual Whitaker Foundation Gala, an event Charles rarely missed, though never for pleasure. This year, however, he had invited someone, Grace. She had hesitated when he asked. "I'm not much for red carpets and champagne," she'd said. "Come anyway," he'd replied. They could use a dose of sincerity. Now, standing beneath the grand chandeliers of the Metropolitan Ballroom, Grace felt completely out of place. The room sparkled with designer gowns, tuxedos, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Conversations buzzed with stock updates and private schools. Charles hadn't arrived yet. She lingered by the edge of the crowd, sipping water, her gaze scanning for a familiar face, not that she expected to find one. When Charles finally entered, all eyes turned. He cut through the room like a blade calm, commanding, untouchable, until he saw her. His steps slowed, something softened. "Sorry I'm late," he said, offering his arm. "You're forgiven," she said, taking it. "You clean up all right. You look like poetry," he said quietly. She laughed. "You've been reading Hallmark cards again?" He grinned. "Just the back of your fabric swatches." The first half-hour passed in polite introductions and light conversation. Charles stayed close, but the night wasn't kind. The moment came when one of his board members, Gordon Avery, a man whose smile was sharper than any knife, approached. "Well, well," Gordon said, eyes sliding over Grace. "Charles, always full of surprises." "This is Grace Holloway," Charles said evenly. "A tailor, was it, or community outreach?" His tone was laced with something slick and condescending. Grace extended her hand. "Calm, seamstress, actually, but I prefer small business owner who can hem better than most men can lead." Gordon blinked. Others nearby chuckled. Charles fought a smile. But then another woman, dripping diamonds, added with faux innocence, "And how did the two of you meet?" At the dry cleaner's, Charles stiffened. Grace placed her drink down gently. "I'm going to get some air." "Grace." She shook her head, eyes steady. "It's all right." But it wasn't. Outside, on the grand marble terrace. Grace leaned against the railing, staring out at the city. The wind tugged at her shawl, but she didn't move. She'd known it would be like this. Their worlds weren't made to blend. She could patch fabric, not people. A moment later, Charles stepped out beside her. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. "Don't be," she replied, arms crossed. "It's not new. The looks, the assumptions, I've seen it before. They don't speak for me. No, but they speak about you, about what your world values." Charles leaned on the railing. "Do you regret coming?" Grace looked at him. "No, but I hate pretending to be something I'm not. You never have to. That's the thing. Charles, I don't pretend, but I think you still do." The words hit harder than he expected. Grace turned toward him. "I've watched you thread needles with shaking hands and still try. That's the man I came to know, not the one who lets cowards in cufflinks define the room." Charles said nothing. She stepped back. "I'm not angry, just reminded of what that I sew broken things, not broken systems, and then she left, back inside. The music swelled. People danced, toasted, laughed, but Charles didn't return to the party. He stood there, in the cold, the city sprawling below, and for once he didn't feel like a part of it, not the city, not the celebration, not even his own name. What had he wanted tonight to impress her, to show her he belonged to both worlds? He'd only proven he was still deeply entangled in one. At home that night, Charles poured himself a drink and left it untouched. He sat on the edge of the sofa, suit jacket tossed aside, hands steepled beneath his chin. He replayed every moment of the evening, every word Grace had said. And then, for the first time in years, he didn't think about quarterly profits or shareholder meetings or asset retention. He thought about a lavender dress, sewn by hand, and the woman who wore it with more dignity than anyone in that ballroom. And he wondered if he could ever deserve her. Rain fell steadily on Brooklyn the next morning, soft and persistent, like the kind that insisted on being noticed, but didn't demand it. The sidewalks glistened, and the windows of stitched-in Grace fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Grace Holloway stood by her front counter, folding a finished quilt for the shelter nearby. Her movements were calm, practiced, but her mind was elsewhere. The gala had left a bruise, not from humiliation she'd long grown used to people underestimating her, but from disappointment. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Charles Whitaker had left that world behind, or at least had begun to. But last night proved otherwise, not entirely, but enough. The bell above the door chimed softly. She looked up, expecting a customer. It was Charles, soaked to the bone, without an umbrella. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, water dripping from the edges of his coat, eyes unreadable. "I forgot how inconvenient rain can be," he said at last. Grace said nothing. She turned back to her folding. "I was wrong," he added, "last night, about what she asked, still not looking at him, about thinking I could invite you into my world without facing what it really is." Now she turned. "It's not about the party, Charles." "Then what is it about?" Grace hesitated. "It's about choice. I chose to step into that room. You chose not to speak when they made me feel small." Charles looked down. "I didn't know how." Grace softened slightly. "That's the difference between us. I don't get that option." He moved toward the counter, slowly, as if approaching something fragile. "Let me help," he said. "With what?" "Anything. Everything." She shook her head. "This isn't your mess to fix." Charles exhaled. "But I want to, not because I pity you, or because I feel guilty, but because I care." That stopped her. His voice dropped. "You're not just a side project in a slow quarter. You make me feel human." Grace blinked, startled by the rawness in his tone. He added, "And that terrifies me." There was silence, heavy but not hostile. Grace walked to the back, returning with a worn towel. "Start by drying off," she said, handing it to him. He took it, carefully dabbing his hair and shoulders. Grace glanced toward the corner where rolls of fabric waited to be cut. "I have a delivery to prep. The women's shelter needs a fresh batch of warm wraps. My assistant's out sick." Charles rolled up his sleeves. "Tell me what to do." The hours that followed were quiet but full. Charles helped measure and fold, pin and label. His stitches were sloppy, but his hands steady. He took instructions without pride and made jokes that didn't always land, but Grace smiled anyway. At one point, she noticed him trying to fold a delicate silk scarf into a box too small. "You're wrinkling it," she said gently. He looked at the twisted mess, symbolic, really, of what, my entire approach to life? She laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real, and he smiled at the sound. Later that afternoon, the old sewing machine gave a sharp clank and whined before stopping cold. "Not again," Grace muttered, kneeling beside it. Charles was beside her instantly. "What happened? She's old. Wires are fussy. I've repaired her more times than I can count. Can I buy you a new one?" Grace looked at him. "No." "But no," she repeated. "This isn't charity. Charles. It's something else. An investment he offered." She shook her head. "A promise. One we keep ourselves." He sat back, watching her fiddle with the machine. "You make everything sound like a vow." "That's what care is," she said. "Not just showing up when it's easy, but staying when it's not." That night, when the last wrap was boxed and labeled, they sat on the floor with tea and shared silence like a blanket. Grace finally broke it. "Why did you really come today?" Charles looked into his cup. "Because I've spent a lifetime building empires, and I've never been prouder than when I fixed a seam with you." She blinked slowly. "That's quite a statement." She said, "I mean it?" He paused. "And I meant it when I said you terrify me. Why? Because you see through me, and I don't know what to do with that." Grace reached over, covering his hand with hers. "Maybe nothing," she said softly. "Maybe just let it be seen." Charles looked at her and for the first time truly let himself be looked at. Not judged, not analyzed, just seen. Monday morning dawned with a rare stillness over Manhattan. But inside Whitaker Tower, the air was sharp with tension. Charles Whitaker arrived later than usual, a full hour past his norm. His assistant, Nathan, looked up from his desk, startled to see his boss without a tie, sleeves loosely rolled, and, most shocking of all, a faint trace of a smile. "Is everything all right?" Sir Nathan asked. Charles glanced at him, pausing only briefly. "Depends on your definition of all right." "Cancel my first 2 meetings." Nathan blinked. "Sir, one of them is with Tokyo." "They can wait," Charles said. "I've got something more important." He turned on his heel, heading into his office. He didn't check the markets. He didn't open his emails. Instead, he opened a blank notepad and began writing by hand, a habit he hadn't indulged since his early 20s. Across the city, Grace Holloway knelt beside the old sewing machine, finally coaxing it back to life with a twist of wire and a flick of determination. The smell of old metal and fresh thread filled her shop like a familiar song. The morning light streamed through the window, casting long, soft shadows across bolts of fabric. A delivery box from a local woman's shelter sat by the door proof that even the smallest stitch could make a difference. And then her phone rang. "Grace Holloway, yes. This is Evelyn Grant, Program Director at Hope Haven Women's Initiative. I just reviewed your application for expansion funding." Grace straightened. "Yes, I'm afraid. The banks pulled their co-sponsorship. Without their support, we won't be able to proceed." The line felt like it went silent forever. "I see," Grace said softly. "I'm truly sorry. Your proposal was beautiful." Grace smiled faintly. "Thank you for your time She hung up and stood still, the hum of the machine now feeling strangely distant. That afternoon, Charles showed up at the shop. No announcement, no entourage, just him, holding a takeout bag and looking surprisingly humble. "Lunch," he said, raising the bag. "Chinese." The lady at the counter said the dumplings were life-altering. Grace managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You all right?" he asked, setting the food on the counter. "Funding fell through," she said simply. For the expansion, she nodded. "It's fine. I'll figure something else out." Charles didn't speak. He just watched her, saw the flicker of disappointment beneath her calm, the way she kept her shoulders squared even when her heart sagged. Then he pulled out a check. She held up a hand. "No, you haven't even seen the amount." "I don't need to." "Grace, this isn't about money." "Charles, not everything can be solved by writing a check." He set the check on the counter anyway. "Then consider it a placeholder. For something better?" She looked at it, then at him. "You don't trust me to figure this out myself. I trust you more than I've ever trusted anyone. That's why I want to help." Grace stared at him for a long moment. Then she gently folded the check in half and slid it back to him. "Then help me the way I need, not the way that's easy for you." That night, Charles returned home to chaos, a half-dozen missed calls, news reports swirling with speculation. Market analysts predicting his mood swings were impacting confidence. But Charles didn't pace, didn't argue. He simply poured tea, sat down, and thought. Then he called Nathan. "Draft a press release." He said, "We're launching a new initiative, Profit with Purpose." Nathan nearly choked. "I'm sorry, what will start small?" Charles continued. "Community partnerships, support for grassroots organizations, highlight emotional intelligence in leadership." "Sir, with respect, the board won't like this." Charles leaned back in his chair. "Then they can find another CEO." A long silence followed. Nathan cleared his throat. "I'll begin the draft." 3 days later, Grace was at the shop when a box arrived. No return label, just her name in elegant handwriting. Inside, wrapped in simple brown paper, were 3 brand-new, top-of-the-line sewing machines and a handwritten note, "For the women who sew their own futures, no strings attached." C.W. Grace stared at the machines, then at the note, then out the window, as if the sky itself had just shifted slightly. Later that evening, she called him. "You sent the machines," she said. "You needed them. You did it your way. I tried to do it yours." Grace smiled. "It's not the machines that matter." "I know." A pause. "Would you come by tomorrow?" she asked. "There's something I want to show you." When Charles arrived, she led him to the back of the shop, where a simple corkboard had been mounted. On it were photos, letters, and thank-you notes from dozens of women, each note a story, each face a triumph. "This is who you're helping," Grace said. "Not me, them." Charles stepped closer, taking in every picture, every name. One letter caught his eye, a woman who had escaped an abusive marriage, found healing through sewing, and now taught others the same skill. Grace saw him pause. "She's why I started the expansion project," she said. She believed no one would ever see her again. Charles whispered, "But you did." "Yes." And when he turned to her, something was different. Not just admiration, but reverence for her strength, her vision, her choice to stay soft in a hard world. He didn't try to kiss her. He just said, "I want to be a part of this, not from above, not from a distance, right here." Grace touched his arm. "Then stay and learn. It won't be easy." He smiled. The best things never are. The city buzzed in late spring, with windows thrown open and sidewalks blooming in conversation. But at Stitched in Grace, the rhythm was steady and intentional, like a heart that had finally found its beat. Grace Holloway stood at the front of the shop, pinning the final flyer onto a new corkboard. The title read, "Sewing with Grace." Now enrolling free classes for women rebuilding their lives. The project she had once only dared to dream was now real. The machines had been installed, the volunteers were gathering, and the applications were rolling in. She exhaled deeply, pressing her palms to the flyer. It felt fragile and strong all at once. Just then, the bell above the door jingled. Charles Whitaker walked in, not in his usual pressed suit, but in a soft button-down and jeans. He carried a tray with 2 paper cups. "Tea," he said. "From the place you say overcharges, but makes it worth it." Grace smiled, taking the cup. "So you finally trust my judgment, I'm learning," he said, looking around. "The place looks different. It feels like a beginning." As the afternoon sun dipped, casting golden threads across the walls, Grace led Charles to the back. The new space was clean, open, and quietly alive. A few women sat at the sewing tables, stitching carefully, chatting quietly. There was laughter, the clink of scissors, the buzz of machines. Charles watched in awe. One woman looked up and smiled at him. "You're the guy from the fancy building, right?" He blinked. "I guess I am. You're helping Grace." "I'm trying." She nodded. "Good. She helps everybody else. Someone ought to return the favor." Grace appeared beside him, arms crossed. "See, they're already on your case. I'll consider it a promotion," he said. Later that week, Grace faced a new challenge. The local bank had denied a small business loan she had applied for months ago, citing limited scalability. Without it, the outreach program would struggle to expand into evening classes or fund transportation for participants. She sat on the back steps that evening, tea cooling in her hands, when Charles arrived. He could tell something had shifted. "Talk to me," he said, sitting beside her. She handed him the letter. He read it, jaw tightening. "I'll handle it," he said immediately. Grace shook her head. "No, that's not what I need. You want me to sit and do nothing while they shut you down. I want you to help me find another way, one that doesn't make this yours instead of ours." Charles leaned forward. "Then what do? We invite them in. Show them what we're doing. Let the community speak for us." He looked at her, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it your way." And so they planned an open house. They sent invites, posted flyers, called friends, and encouraged every woman who had passed through Grace's doors to come share their story. Charles called in a few favors too, but only those who would come as listeners, not judges. The event day arrived like spring after a long winter. People came more than expected. Neighbors, former clients, local reporters, even a few business executives, still stiff in posture but curious in their eyes. One by one, the women spoke. A young mother who now sewed part-time to pay for childcare. An elderly widow who found friendship in the hum of machines, a teenager who stopped skipping school because of the mentorship she found in Grace. And through it all, Charles stood at the back of the room, quiet, watching, witnessing. When it was Grace's turn, she stepped forward wearing a dress stitched from scraps, each panel a different color, representing a different woman. I used to think stitches were just about repair. She began. But I've learned they're also about resilience, about creating something stronger where it was once torn. She glanced toward Charles, and sometimes, she continued, they're about weaving new things together, two lives, two worlds, trying to make something good. The room held its breath. She smiled. Thank you for being part of this tapestry. That night, they stayed to clean up alone. The space echoed with the warmth of voices that had filled it just hours before. Charles handed her a broom. You were brilliant. You were quiet, she teased. I was in awe. She leaned against the wall. You don't have to be anyone but yourself here. Charles, I'm still figuring out who that is. You're doing just fine. A silence settled between them, soft, intentional. He stepped closer. This place, you've made me want to stay in one place long enough to grow. Grace looked up at him. Are you planting roots, Mr. Whitaker? He smiled. Only if you'll help me water them. Her hand found his. That's the easiest promise I've ever made. 6 months later, the space behind Stitched in Grace had transformed into something almost magical. Once just a dusty storeroom with forgotten bolts of fabric, it now pulsed with purpose. Rows of new machines buzzed softly. A mural of patchwork butterflies, painted by local teens, stretched across one wall. Laughter mingled with the scent of lavender oil and fresh-baked muffins, donated daily by the bakery next door. At the front of the new wing, a wooden plaque read, "The Holloway Whitaker Center for Community Craft and Care." Charles Whitaker stood quietly in the corner, adjusting his tie, though it refused to stay straight. He wasn't used to ties anymore, or at least not ones worn for joy instead of power. Grace Holloway came up behind him, gently swatting his hands away. Let me. She fixed his collar and smoothed the lapels with a touch both practiced and tender. Better, she said. You always make things better, Charles replied. The opening ceremony was simple, just how Grace wanted. Families sat on mismatched chairs. The mayor gave a short speech. A teenage girl recited a poem. One of the women from the program shared how she now owned her own Etsy shop. And then it was Charles's turn. He stepped up to the makeshift podium, his voice steady but gentle. There was a time, he began, when I believed success could be measured in digits, in deals, in distance from other people's needs. He paused, locking eyes with Grace. But then I met a woman who stitched dignity into every seam, who measured success in warmth, in second chances, in the hands that hold rather than the ones that push away. The room went still. She reminded me that the strongest thread isn't power, it's care. And that's the thread we hope to weave through this place from every lesson taught, every laugh shared, every life mended. Applause rose like light breaking through clouds. That evening, as the guests filed out, Grace and Charles stayed behind to clean. They moved in sync, stacking chairs, folding banners, sweeping glitter confetti off the floor. At one point, Charles found himself at the quilt wall, dozens of square patches, each embroidered by someone touched by the program. His fingers brushed over one, stitched in a shaky hand. Healing starts when someone listens. Grace joined him there, slipping her hand into his. "You kept your promise," she said. "So did you." He turned to her. "There's something I've been working on." She arched a brow. Another initiative. Not quite. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a silver thimble charm. On it, a single sapphire glimmered like a stitched tear turned to light. "I didn't want to give you a ring that meant possession," he said softly. "I wanted to give you something that meant partnership." Grace's breath caught. "I'm not asking for forever," he continued. "I'm asking for every day you're willing to keep choosing this life with me, to keep mending and learning and showing me what it means to stay soft." Tears welled in her eyes. She whispered, "Yes, 1,000 yeses." He smiled, slipping the charm into her palm. No lawyers involved, just love. They embraced beneath the quilt wall, as if held by every story stitched behind them. A year later, the Holloway Whitaker Center had become a case study in social entrepreneurship. Other cities called, wanting to replicate the model. Corporations began hiring Charles for purpose-driven leadership consulting. The very board members who once doubted him now praised him at investor conferences. But Charles didn't care for any of that. What mattered most was the ritual he and Grace had built. Every Friday, they shared breakfast on the studio steps. Every Sunday, they walked to the park, rain or shine. Every morning, he kissed her shoulder before she woke up, whispering, "Thank you for choosing me again, one particular afternoon." Charles stood before a group of young entrepreneurs at a business school, presenting a lecture titled Return on Empathy. At the end, a student raised her hand. "What's been your most successful acquisition?" "Mr. Whitaker." He paused, smiling slowly. "A thimble," he said, "and the woman who taught me how to use it. In a world chasing speed, status, and success sometimes, what we truly need is to slow down and be seen." This story reminds us that even the most hardened hearts can soften, not through grand gestures or wealth, but through simple acts of kindness, consistency, and courage to show up again and again. Charles Whitaker's journey is not just about love, it's about transformation. About unlearning the belief that strength means being distant, and discovering that real strength lies in vulnerability, in listening, and in choosing presence over power. Grace Holloway teaches us that softness is not weakness, that caring deeply, standing firm in your values, and helping others find their voice can quietly change the world. For those of us in the later seasons of life, this story is a gentle reminder it's never too late to begin again, to love differently, to lead with heart, to repair what's broken, not just in fabric, but in each other. Because in the end, it's not what we build with our hands that defines us, but what we mend with our hearts. Thank you for sharing this story with us. If it touched your heart, made you smile, or reminded you of something worth holding on to, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to life, stories that heal, connect, and remind us all of what truly matters. We'll see you in the next chapter. Until then, take care and keep your heart open.